I'll start with
Good morning. Thank you for your patience and welcome to this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. My name is Surisha Gunta. I'm an attorney with the partnership, and with us today we have Taylor Harper from TFH Legal, who will be speaking to us today about everything you need to know about serving alcohol at your nonprofit's event. Before Taylor speaks to us this morning, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. The mission of the organization is to maximize the impact of pro bono engagement by connecting a network of attorneys with nonprofits in need of free business legal services. If you are interested in more information about our organization, please visit our website. We serve clients who are 501c3 nonprofits in the Metro Atlanta area or serving populations in the Metro Atlanta area that are low income or disadvantaged individuals. And these nonprofits are otherwise unable to afford legal services. On our website, you can apply to be a client if you're interested. And we also have a wealth of resources on our website, including webcasts from the past. And today's webcast will also be posted on there in a couple of days. And please keep in mind that this information includes just general guidelines. If you have any specific questions related to your nonprofit, please reach out to your attorney. And today's webcast is copyrighted. And now we'll learn more. Thank you, Taylor.
Thank you. Good morning. Again, my name is Taylor Harper. I'm a shareholder at TFH Legal. My practice focuses on representing clients in the beverage alcohol industry that ranges from retailers like restaurants and bars to breweries, distilleries, wholesalers, and nonprofits seeking special event permits. So we're going to talk about nonprofit events and the intersection of furnishing alcohol to attendees, and to understand the complex web of intersecting jurisdictions and laws that govern the beverage alcohol industry. We really have to go back in time a bit. And so I'm not going to be one of the presenters that just reads line by line of these slides, but I do very much like this first quote under setting the stage. We're going to take us back to the 1700s and 1800s. And it was said that, "I am sure the Americans can fix nothing without a drink. If you meet, you drink. If you part, you drink. If you make acquaintance, you drink. If you close a bargain, you drink. They drink because it's hot, they drink because it's cold. If successful in elections, they drink and rejoice. If not, they drink and swear. They begin to drink early in the morning, they leave off late at night. They commence it early in life, and they continue it until they soon drop into the grave." Needless to say that alcohol consumption was extremely prevalent in the 1700s and the 1800s, and it was so in a way that it really isn't today. Today it's prevalent in our social life. In the 1700s and 1800s, it was prevalent and permeated every aspect of life. And I could go off on a tangent as to the many reasons for that, but the biggest one would have been the people's fear of waterborne illnesses, and they relied on fermented or distilled or brewed, vented product beverages to avoid any sort of waterborne illnesses. So there was a lot of alcohol consumption going on, 1700s, 1800s. There was, even what they call grog time, where employers would let the employees go and consume usually beer at 11 a.m. and 4 p.m. every day. So, try to imagine that these days. The general kind of stat that's given is that if you picture alcohol consumption today and multiplied that by 3, you'd have some idea of what it was like in the 1700s and 1800s. All of that overconsumption led to what people thought were abuses of alcohol consumption, abuses of the way in which alcohol was sold and furnished, and that led to Prohibition, which was the 18th Amendment. It was passed in 1919, went into effect in 1920, and it was only in effect for a mere 13 years until it was repealed in 1933 by the 21st Amendment. And that's really where the regulations that we see today governing the beverage alcohol industry start. Upon repeal, the beverage alcohol industry was structured in such a way so as to prevent those abuses from reoccurring, the abuses that led to Prohibition in the first place. At least that was the idea. So there's some foundational aspects of the alcohol industry, some concepts, terms that we need to be familiar with in order to have a discussion about the licensing and permitting process and to understand why some of what may appear as very archaic laws are still in place and where they come from. The first is that there are 3 jurisdictions that govern the alcohol industry. At the top, you have the federal government, which is the Alcohol, Tobacco, Tax, and Trade Bureau. It's under the Department of Treasury and generally referred to as the TTB. You also have the individual states. For Georgia, it's the Department of Revenue that governs alcohol and tobacco, and there's an alcohol and tobacco division within the Department of Revenue. And then you have your local jurisdiction, which is the municipality. In a nonprofit's case, it would be the municipality where the event is going to be held, or if it's outside of a municipality, it would be in that unincorporated county. There is also, generally speaking, there are 3 tiers of the industry. At the top, you have suppliers, which are manufacturers, breweries, distilleries, wineries, importers. Next, you have wholesalers, which are also referred to as distributors. So the wholesaler purchases product from the supplier and then turns around and sells it to and transports it to the retailers. Retailers being bars, restaurants, hotels, gas stations, grocery stores, anything that's selling alcohol to consumers. In the case of a nonprofit hosting a special event, if you had to obtain a special event permit, you would be considered to be operating on the retail tier. And one of the distinctions to make between these 3 tiers, the suppliers and wholesalers have to deal with all 3 levels of jurisdiction. So the suppliers and wholesalers have to get permitted or licensed by the federal, state, and local, whereas retailers really only have to deal with the state and local. So when you're applying for a special event permit, for instance, you're only dealing with the state and local, and you don't have to worry about the federal government aspect. Another important concept in turn is tied house. There are tied house prohibitions. And what that means, before Prohibition came about, it was often the case that alcohol manufacturers owned or had some sort of control over saloons in such a way that a saloon would only sell that manufacturer's product to the exclusion of other manufacturers' products. So for instance, if you went into a town and you're on Main Street, you may have a saloon that only sold Anheuser-Busch products. another one that only sold cores, and so on and so on. And the idea was that that led to a proliferation of saloons, which led to intemperance and overconsumption. And part of the problem is many of the alcohol manufacturers were not located in close proximity to the saloons, so there was this absentee ownership aspect and a push for increased sales volume without much regard to the patrons of those establishments and their well-being. So in order to prevent that, after repeal of prohibition, the federal government and states decided, all right, we're not going to allow cross-tier ownership. So you can't have an ownership interest in, say, a brewery and then also have an ownership interest in a restaurant that would operate on the retail tier. Now, that may not seem applicable to a nonprofit obtaining a special event permit, but I'll explain where that can come up shortly. But generally, when you hear Tied House, you need to think about, it's all about retailer independence. It's about the idea or concept that a retailer, being a restaurant, a bar, should be able to decide for itself what products it wants to sell, and it shouldn't be coerced or induced by a manufacturer in some way to sell only that manufacturer's products to the exclusion of other manufacturers' products. In addition to ownership, there are other ways that a manufacturer could have influence over a retailer, and those ways are generally referred to as thing of value. A manufacturer could provide some sort of thing of value to a retailer and then threaten to withdraw that thing of value if the retailer doesn't do what the manufacturer says. And as you can see on this slide, those are some ways in which historically manufacturers would exert control or influence over retailers, giving the bars to retailers, paying for the electric signs or equipment, offering credit to retailers. All of those things now have been prohibited by the states and by the federal government and by most local jurisdictions as well. And the last piece, which shouldn't concern you too much, but just to make sure we cover all the bases, franchise laws. And this, when I say franchise, I don't want you to really think of like McDonald's or Subway, not that type of franchise, although the reason we call it franchise laws ultimately stems from that concept. A manufacturer has to, let's just take a brewery, a Georgia brewery. A Georgia brewery, in order for its products to be sold at various retail outlets, has to go through a wholesaler. And it has to pick one wholesaler for each product for a particular territory. And those territories are usually broken down by county. So a Georgia brewery would have to pick one wholesaler to distribute its IPA in Fulton County. And once it chooses that wholesaler, it can't get out of that relationship unless it can show good cause. And that can be a difficult threshold to meet. So many suppliers think of the franchise laws kind of like a marriage. And suppliers need to be careful about who they choose to marry in terms of this business arrangement with wholesalers, because they're going to be stuck with them, so to speak, for quite some time. The franchise won't really come up when you're applying for special event permits, but where it will come up is in the fact that you will be dealing with wholesalers to some extent. Let's kind of discuss how a special event generally should work. This is assuming that you're going to have some form of alcohol sales at your event. which would trigger the requirement to need a special event permit. You'll have to get that permit from the respective local jurisdiction as well as the state through the Department of Revenue. And once permitted, well, how does the alcohol get there? Well, if you hold a special event permit, you're considered a temporary retailer. You're operating on that bottom retail tier. And retailers can only get their alcohol from wholesalers. So whatever alcohol is coming to your event should come through a wholesaler. And, let's say, for instance, that you want Creature Comforts beer there and you want Red Brick beer there. Well, Creature Comforts has a different wholesaler than Red Brick has. So you're going to have to coordinate with those respective wholesalers as to how to get that product to your event. So just keep that in mind as you go through this process, because that's better to start sooner than later. You don't want to be 2 days before the event trying to figure out who's the wholesaler and how am I going to get the product here, and are they going to have time to deliver it. I want to spin back to the Tide House concept and kind of illustrate where that's come up before and maybe some things to watch out for. 4 or 5 years ago, I had a brewery client that was approached by a nonprofit that wanted to host an event, a fundraising event at the brewery, and there was a rental agreement. They rented out the space for, I think, a 24-hour period. The nonprofit went to apply for its special event permit and obtained one from the city of Atlanta and obtained one from the state. And as it was going through the state application process, the Department of Revenue, an agent with the Department of Revenue, came to the brewery and actually cited the brewery for violation of, it's what we call a prohibited business association, but really it's a violation of a Tide House principle. And the violation was that you have a brewery, a supplier that's engaging in a business association of sorts with a temporary retailer, because a special event permittee is considered a temporary retailer. Now, I thought that was absurd. We argued with the Department of Revenue about it, and they stood their ground. There's actually an exemption from Tide House prohibitions at the federal level specifically for temporary retailers, for special event permittees. But Georgia did not want to adopt that at the time. So we had to push over the course of the next couple of years during legislative session to have that changed. And ultimately the Department of Revenue promulgated new rules with respect to special events that can be hosted on the premises of a brewery, such that it does not violate these Tide House principles. But you can see how those things do actually come into play. So at least you know now that you could have an event on the premises of a brewery or a distillery, given that these new regulations are in place. Another example where it comes up is in this idea of a thing of value. We had a client, a brewery client, whose product was being sold at a special event that wasn't being hosted on the side of a brewery or a distillery. It was being hosted at a retailer, and the brewery donated umbrellas with the brewery name on it to be out on the patio during the special event. And the Department of Revenue came in and threatened to issue a citation based upon the brewery was giving a retailer a thing of value by giving them these umbrellas, even though they were just loaning the umbrellas for the event, and they had to take the umbrellas back lest they wanted to get a citation from the Department of Revenue. So you need to be mindful of things like that when if a manufacturer, if a distillery or a brewery or a winery is giving you, the nonprofit, something where they're not charging you fair market value for it. That could be considered a thing of value. And while in most cases the nonprofit is not going to be cited, thank goodness, it could get the manufacturer cited, and we're always in the business of trying to avoid citations altogether. So let's talk a little bit about the actual process. If some local jurisdictions are much easier than others, some are merely administrative, so it's paperwork that you file, and within a few days or a few weeks, you turn around and you get a special event permit. Other jurisdictions are somewhat more cumbersome, one of those being the City of Atlanta. City of Atlanta has what I would say is probably the most detailed and cumbersome alcohol license process in the state. There are oftentimes multiple meetings and hearings that have to be attended, and for the most part, even a special event permittee or an applicant for a special event permit has to jump through all the same hurdles. So there's going to be the application form itself. It's pretty extensive for the City of Atlanta. It's going to want a lot of personal information. It's going to want a lot of information, specifics about the event itself. Where exactly is it going to be located? They're going to want a diagram. They're going to want to know where fencing is going to be. How are you going to keep, other maybe pedestrians that are walking by from crossing into the event. There's going to be a host of information that they're going to want, in addition to all the other requirements with respect to background checks, fingerprinting, other qualification requirements, which consist of, you have to have an individual that's going to be associated with the license. So let's say you're, ABC Inc., and you're a 501c3, and you're applying for a special event permit with the City of Atlanta. There's still going to have to be an individual, what the city refers to as an agent, associated with that application and with that license. And that agent has to reside in one of the metro Atlanta counties, and has to be obviously a resident of Georgia. And so the agent will be the one that's really filling out all of that personal information on the application. Yeah, certainly there'll be a lot of stuff that's filled out with respect to the business itself and the location of the event and details of the event. But when it comes to the personal information, for the most part, it'll be that of whoever's going to serve as the individual agent. And sometimes you're going to also have to get personal information for the officers and directors of the nonprofit. In certain instances, they're going to ask for financial investment documentation. They're going to know where the funds are coming from to put on this event. They're going to want to see, I have here a lease or deed, but really it's not a lease or deed, more of a rental agreement in the case of a nonprofit that's going to rent a space for an event. That rental agreement, it can't just be a proposed agreement. It has to be fully executed. You're going to have to show that if you, let's say you're an out-of-state nonprofit, you'd have to show that you have authorization to do business in Georgia. If you're a Georgia nonprofit, you'll have to show all of your corporate documents to show that you're properly formed and registered with the state. And you're also, if you want the discounted fee, you're going to have to show proof of your 501c3 status. Once you've completed the application, you've got all the necessary documents that you need in place, In Atlanta, you're going to have to schedule a meeting with the licensing division with an inspector, and you will go and you'll meet with the inspector, and you'll go through the application and all of the materials, and assuming nothing is missing or out of place, then they will put you on the agenda for what's called an NPU, or a neighborhood planning unit meeting. The city of Atlanta is divided into neighborhood planning units, and so wherever your event is going to be held, you'll have to go to the respective NPU meeting. Those meetings are generally held once a month, and so you need to take that meeting into account as you're planning, because let's say the respective NPU meets on the fourth Tuesday of each month, and for whatever reason you're not able to go this month and you miss it. Well, okay, that pushes you off till the fourth Tuesday of the following month, and you can't go to the subsequent license review board hearing until you've gone to the neighborhood planning unit meeting. And so it can push everything back if you're unable to meet one of those meetings. And as I just referenced, the license review board, generally you're not going to have to go actually appear at the license review board. Other than special event permittees, all other applicants actually have to appear and give a little spiel about what their project is about and what experience they have with alcohol. With respect to special event permittees, you're put on a consent agenda, and it's generally the whole consent agenda is just approved, and so you don't have to actually appear, which is helpful and makes the process somewhat less burdensome for the agent, the person that's going to serve as agent for the special event permit. The city of Atlanta used to have an advertising requirement. They just this past week did away with that, which is great. There are some other local jurisdictions that even for a special event, they still have an advertising requirement. I think it's unnecessary, but it is what it is, and it can oftentimes be quite expensive. I've seen it up to $1,100, $1,200, $1,300 to run an advertisement for one event. You're going to have inspections. You are going to have possibly health inspection, fire inspection, and building inspections. And you have to coordinate all of those, and that can be a little cumbersome as well. So the timing of it, right? You go to the NPU, you've completed that, then you're put on the license review board. Generally, after you've gone to the NPU, I would start coordinating with the health department, with the fire department, with the building department to get the necessary inspections completed. Once your event has been put on the consent agenda and has been approved by the license review board, the whole application then goes to the mayor's office. And the mayor has to sign off on the application or off on the license, but cannot do so until all those inspections are complete. And in my experience, if you can get those inspections complete prior to the file being shipped up to the mayor's office, you have it'll be signed off on much faster than if it goes to the mayor's desk and you don't have those inspections complete, and then it has to go into a separate pile that is, just waiting for inspections to be wrapped up before the mayor can even look at it. So the whole process takes, you can get it done in maybe a month and a half if you're lucky and you're really pushing it and there are no hiccups. I would never recommend trying to do it in a month and a half. I would say start 90 to 120 days out from your event. if at all possible, just so that you can make sure you get on the agenda for the neighborhood planning unit and the license review board, and you have time to get the inspections complete, and you don't put unnecessary pressure on yourself with respect to your social media campaign for the event. Because what I have seen is where folks make a big social media push to try to sell tickets and promote the event on a specific day, and they haven't wrapped up this alcohol piece and the alcohol licensing piece, and then a week or 2 weeks before the event, the nonprofit is in a panic because they've told the whole world that they're going to have this great event with all this different types of beer and wine or distilled spirits, and then they're uncertain whether they're actually going to be able to pull that off because of waiting till the last minute. So sooner the better. After you get the local license, then you can apply for the state.
A question about the application for the local license.
Sure.
So if you have an annual fundraiser or gala, do you have to submit this application annually, or does it apply for a certain number of years?
Yeah, so if you have, the question is that if you do an event annually, do you have to apply each year? Or how long does the special event permit last? And yes, you do have to apply each year. It can be a little bit easier if we talked about the agent that's associated with the application. If the agent is going to remain the same, you don't always have to resubmit everything for that agent, but you'll still have to resubmit everything with respect to the business and with respect to the particular event and the location of the event. Somewhat unfortunate. There are jurisdictions, however, that there's only a few of them that will issue. It's an annual permit that's good for a certain number of events within the year. So if you were going to do it quarterly, let's say, you would be able to host 4 events throughout the year under that one permit. But very few jurisdictions operate that way, and City of Atlanta does not. And you would still have to also apply again for the state permit. And so with respect to the state permit, you can't apply for it, or you're not supposed to apply for it until you have your local license. There are instances where if you're in a bind, the Georgia Department of Revenue will try to work with you. If they know that you've applied for the license, let's say you've already gone to the license review board, or it was on the consent agenda for the license review board, and you're in the process of wrapping up those inspections, but you've waited till the last minute and you need to get the state permit going, sometimes the Department of Revenue will work with you and they'll start the application process based upon the fact that you're almost through with the local license process, and it looks like it's pretty guaranteed that you're going to get the local license. The state permit process is, in my opinion, much simpler than the City of Atlanta process. You need to do it at least 10 days prior to the date of the event, and it's going to be, in terms of the information that you have to provide, very similar to the information that's provided at the local jurisdiction. You're going to be providing personal information, citizenship affidavits, fingerprints. They'll want to do a tax clearance of the individuals that are involved. The difference is that sometimes the individual who's serving as the agent at the local level isn't necessarily always an officer or a director of the nonprofit. And when you apply at the state level, the personal information you're providing is for the officers of the corporation as opposed to the individual agent. Now, oftentimes it just happens that whoever's serving as the individual agent also happens to be an officer, and that can be the person that's reported at the state level. But it does happen from time to time where you're reporting different people. An agent for the local level that's not an officer, and then reporting an officer at the state level. So you have to keep that in mind when you're trying to coordinate and get a lot of that personal information compiled so that you can complete these applications. And again, you're going to need the same documents as far as a rental agreement and things of that nature. And that's all done through the Georgia Tax Center site. It's pretty user-friendly and self-explanatory. And again, it's much less cumbersome than the City of Atlanta process. Let's talk about when you need a special event permit. These are a couple of the scenarios that I use to explain this issue of what constitutes a sale of alcohol. The first is, so Jim walks into a hotel, purchases a room for one night for $100, and when he gets to the room, there's a complimentary bottle of champagne next to the bed. Does the hotel need an alcohol license to offer its guest a free bottle of champagne? Yes. The Department of Revenue says that the cost of the bottle of champagne is accounted for or imputed into the $100 that's paid for the room, and you can't get the bottle of champagne unless you also buy the room, so it's contingent upon purchasing the room, and because there's that contingency, it constitutes a sale of alcohol, and you have to have an alcohol license. Another scenario that pops up a lot is with salons. Salons, you go in and you can have a glass of wine or a beer while you wait to get your hair done, or while you get your hair cut. The rule there is, in order for a salon to be able to do that, this is generally speaking, in order for a salon to be able to do that, anybody has to be able to walk in and get that glass of wine without having to get their hair did or having to get a haircut. So the kind of running joke is that you should, on a Saturday, grab your date and just walk around to different salons asking if you can have some wine, because they should have to give it to you. The second scenario is, so a nonprofit wants to host a fundraiser, plans to sell tickets to the event for $25, and at the event, attendees are going to receive free drinks, quote-unquote free drinks. Does the nonprofit need an alcohol license? Yes. The cost of those drinks are included in the $25. It constitutes an alcohol sale. So when would you not need a permit? Well, think of wedding receptions. Birthday parties, that sort of thing. Maybe they're gonna rent out a space and it's a wedding reception, and they're gonna have alcohol there, but they're not selling it. They're not charging for attendance. They're truly just giving it away. It's free alcohol to the guest. In that case, the host of the wedding reception would not need to obtain a special event permit. That host would have to get that alcohol from a retailer like a Total Wine or a grocery store, which would cost the host more than if they were able to get it from a wholesaler like a special event permittee could. Oftentimes, a host of wedding receptions or birthday parties will also use an alcohol caterer. And in that case, the alcohol caterer is a retail level licensee and can buy the alcohol from a wholesaler, and so that the host of the wedding reception or birthday party doesn't have to worry about it. And a nonprofit can use that route too of hiring an alcohol caterer. And oftentimes that can be a good idea because they have experience in not only the process, but how to purchase the product, from whom to purchase the product, how to coordinate all of that, how to deal with issues of service and liquor liability, which we'll get into here in a second. But if you're going to use an alcohol caterer, the event would be operated under that alcohol caterer's license, and you wouldn't need a special event permit. You might need other type of permits, like a festival permit or something like that, if you're having your event outdoors and it meets the requirements of that. But with respect to the alcohol, it would fall under the caterer's license.
I have a question. What if you're having an event and the alcohol is donated to you?
Okay. So the question is, if you're having an event and the alcohol is donated to you, whether the alcohol is donated to you doesn't dictate whether or not you need a special event permit. What dictates whether you need a special event permit is what you're doing with the alcohol once it's been donated. Are you in some way charging attendees for that alcohol? So if you're having a cash bar, you're charging the attendees. If you're selling tickets, you're charging attendees. If you are truly just having an event and you are giving away free alcohol and hoping that people make, donations or buy stuff during the silent auction, then quite possibly you don't need a special event permit. But just the fact that it was donated to you would not dictate whether or not you need a special event permit. Let's talk about potential liability issues. So it's kind of interchangeable terms: social host liability, liquor liability, also commonly referred to as dram shop liability. It's a bar or tavern back in the day was referred to as a dram shop because you would go in and you would buy or ask for a dram of liquor, a dram of whiskey. So it's commonly referred to as dram shop law. And it's actually, in Georgia, the statutes that govern this are referred to as the Dram Shop Act. So what is dram shop? It's who's going to be liable if somebody is overserved and then that person injures somebody else. And the general rule has always been that, there's this assumption of the risk on the part of the patron, of the person that's consuming the alcohol, and that the host or the person that's furnishing the alcohol shouldn't be the one that's liable for it. And that's still generally the rule. That people make their own decisions. There are a couple of exceptions to that, though. And those exceptions are, at least in Georgia, are in two instances. One, if the person furnishing or selling the alcohol serves or sells to a minor, to a person that's under 21. And the other is if you're serving to a person that is noticeably intoxicated. And there's some elements here that have to be met, and it's a pretty high threshold, actually, to meet. So the defendant, which in most of the times in this instance would be the actual person that served the alcohol. So the bartender himself or herself, the bartender had to knowingly furnish alcoholic beverages to a person under 21 years of age, or to someone who was over 21 but was in a state of noticeable intoxication. And the bartender did so knowing that that person would soon be driving a motor vehicle, and then that person went and injured a third party. And then the third party, if all those were met, the third party could potentially go after the bartender. Generally speaking, the company itself that's hosting the party, or the restaurant that's employing the bartender, is not going to be held liable. They are certainly most likely going to be sued along with the bartender, because the plaintiff is going to try to wrap anybody and everybody they can into that suit. And under the theory of respondeat superior, which is that an employer can be liable for the acts of its employees if it's done within the scope of employment. But generally speaking, it is a hard threshold to meet. It's only applicable if the person was noticeably intoxicated. That can be a very factual question and difficult to prove. Nevertheless, just the fact that it happens and that a lawsuit could be filed can be costly and time-consuming and an immense headache for a nonprofit. So if you can avoid that, you should, and there are some things you can do to try to protect yourself against that. The biggest is obtaining what most commonly is referred to as liquor liability insurance, and that applies also to beer and wine. It's not just liquor, but common parlance is liquor liability insurance. And you can get liquor liability insurance for an event, depending on the type of event, how many people, what your policy limits, are going to be, between $100 up to maybe $500 for an event, for one event. If you're at a point where you're going to be applying for a special event permit, you should certainly, I would say almost absolutely, get liquor liability insurance. The cost is well worth it. Even if the potential for an actual suit is low, just the peace of mind that it brings, it makes sense. I'm not going to go through every scenario here. I've put a lot of the statutes in here that are applicable to social host liability. There's even some potential criminal liability associated with it. Now, a liquor liability insurance policy isn't going to have an impact really on whether you have criminal liability under some of these statutes. But again, generally speaking, it's not going to be the company or the officers of the company or the agent that's served, or whoever's serving as the agent with respect to the local license, that's going to be liable here. It's going to be, unless they are the person that's actually serving the alcohol to the individual that was noticeably intoxicated or was under 21, and you should have known that they were going to be driving soon and that they injured a third party. And it's important to note that it's not the individual that you served that can bring the suit. Even if they're injured, they can't bring the suit because they assume the risk. It's the third party that they injured that potentially can bring the suit against the person that served them. Let me see here. So at the end here, there's kind of some key points, takeaways. From a kind of industry-wide perspective, just general terminology and concepts to keep in mind are that there's 3 jurisdictions. There are 3 tiers: supplier, wholesaler, and in retail. And if you're going to be a special event permittee, you're going to operate on the retail tier, at least temporarily. Tied house laws, that's where you have cross-tier ownership, or a manufacturer is giving something of value to a retailer. And then you have the franchise laws, which deal with the relationship between a manufacturer and its wholesaler or wholesalers. You need to determine whether a permit is required, and always err on the side of obtaining a permit if you're not sure, or call us. We can help you walk through that. And you need to remember to check both local and state laws. Sometimes I've had instances where folks have just reviewed state laws and they say, okay, good, I need to do this within 10 days of the event, and then it's 15 days before the event, and they call me and they want some help, and they haven't considered the fact that you have to get the local permit too, and then that sometimes can take 3 months. Another key takeaway: get liquor liability insurance. Doesn't make sense not to. And then another one that should be on here is make sure that you have some mechanism to check identification. Certainly, even if it's everybody's 21 and up, okay, well, how do you know that? You got to have some way that you, at some point at which you checked ID. If you're going to have folks that are under 21, like it's a family affair, but alcohol is going to be served, you're going to probably need to have some sort of wristband system or stamp system if you don't want the bartender or the server checking IDs every time somebody comes. But you certainly need a system in place. That is for really three reasons. One, because you don't want to serve people that are under 21. Two, when you go to the neighborhood planning unit meeting and other meetings that might be required, they're generally going to ask, do you have any sort of mechanism, procedure to check identification? And then if, on the slim chance that you were to actually get cited for serving someone underage, even, simple mistake, well, if you're at the hearing for that citation, it'll help you to be able to argue and say that, as a mitigating factor of sorts, that you had a system in place. You were checking ideas, and this was a simple mistake and a slip, but that you did have a system in place, as opposed to saying, yeah, you're right, we should have been checking ideas. That won't go over well. So have some ID check in place. And I think that's probably about wraps it up.
We have a question about social host liability. Mm-hmm. If you have an event but you don't have a bartender, like it's an open, it's a free event for volunteers, so there's no charge, but there's just a self-serve wine and beer table, how does social host liability play into that?
It's a gray area, and this came up recently, and where I think it would fall is if the host made a decision not to have a real live person furnishing the alcohol and made the decision that it was going to be self-serve, that the host then is going to take the place of a bartender. So if you're potentially opening yourself up to some liability there that might not be there otherwise if you had a bartender. But again, that's why you get that liquor liability insurance.
Well, thank you. That's all the questions we have.
Great.